Japan is an island by the sea filled with volcanoes and it's beautiful. Of course, with thousands of years of history, Japan has gone through some phases of power and decline. Their emperors rose and fell, even moving capitals, and they isolated themselves from the world just because this one island had risen in power and fell. It just so happens that a bunch of these phases have happened relatively recently. By recently, I mean within the last 150 years. Let's look at the rise of Japan, then the fall, then the rise, the fall, and the rise of Japanese power. We start our story off in 1868 during the Meiji and Taisho periods. Japan had pretty much just woken up from a nap that lasted for 200 years, the Edo period. During this 200 years, the island was isolated from the rest of the world, only opening up some ports for the Dutch. It was stable, peaceful, and flourishing in art, culture, and tradition, but the world was changing. Japan was behind and it was time to grow. They didn't open up until the USA pointed huge gunboats at them and told them to start trading or die. Fine, said Japan, we'll open our borders. But during this 200 years of isolation, it turns out that there was a pretty important revolution in Europe. One which was very industrial. Japan still has a feudal peasant system with an expectedly poor population for the system. Luckily, they came out of the Edo period more urban and scientific than ever before, sowing the seeds for their next move. They had to restore themselves in a Meiji style. The Meiji Restoration. The emperor took control back from the shogunate, essentially military rule, and legislative assembly was made. Japan went full western, abolishing the Edo feudal structure, replacing the feudal daimyos with prefectures, and rapid industrialization saw a boom in the new capitalist economy of the island. The average Japanese saw a huge increase in standard of life, wage, freedom, and social mobility at its highest point so far in Japanese history. Businesses were now the main producer of Japan, with the government as the guide, creating a tax reform to invest heavily into education, upholding the rule of law, the military, and infrastructure, especially railway transportation. By 1884, a central bank was created to control the money supply, creating the national currency, the yen, with the gold standard gone by 1917. Yet the biggest change was the full jump into the Industrial Revolution in the 1890s. It was fully embraced when textile factories were set up for home use and selling them to the population centers of India and China. They even had their very first union in 1897 with the Union of Metal Workers. Science and inventions boomed until the early 1900s. Part of this was adopting scientific methods into the military of Japan, who was a little angsty at this point. See, the Japanese government used a system called Fukoku Kyohei, which means rich state, strong army, and yes, their army was getting very, very strong. And alongside a more antsy population when they were forced to give up traditional life and move into massive urban centers, while also nearly doubling in population in 40 years, the people and military were ready to strike. The army and navy took over Taiwan in the 1870s, fought China and Korea in the 1890s, and Russia in the 1900s. All of these Japan took the W in. Japan forcibly took over Korea, opening Korea up to Japanization and industry, but mainly doing it to take their precious materials and labor from the peninsula. By World War I, the Japanese economy had been growing, and the Japanese people fought on the side of the Allies, although they were pretty far away from any of the big fights. They gained control over the Pacific Islands from Germany, and soon had the great idea to become the major powerhouse of the Pacific Ocean, an ambition which would lead to the first fall of Japanese power. Uh-oh, the emperor of the Taisho period is now dead. Time for a new one, with Emperor Hirohito taking over for the Showa period. Hirohito liked a couple of things. He liked Japan, he liked places being Japanese, and he liked making sure some places would be Japanese whether they liked it or not. The first half of the Showa period was characterized by extreme nationalism, expansionism, and militarism. Some parts of the governments had even tried to emulate certain German styles at the time, like blaming the Jews for all of their problems. Except this never really caught on since, well, there weren't that many Jews in Japan. The unrest from extremely rapid industrialization still hadn't worn off yet, and the Japanese were still looking to influence and expand their power beyond their little island. The unrest only grew when the Great Depression hit. Their specialty at the time, heavy industry, was hit the hardest and it made the whole system shrink. By this time, around the 1930s, the average Japanese was around 10 times as poor as the average American. Military rule grew in this time with an attempted coup in 1936 by an ultra-nationalist group trying to overthrow democratic institutions for more nationalistic, fascist ones, only barely being beat out by the emperor's forces. It is also in this time when Japanese rulers got paranoid. See, Japan is a relatively small island that is not resource rich by any standard. Japan needs its colonies to build their army, cities, and nation, and they need the sea lanes open to continue Japanese prosperity and their goal of becoming the great power of the Pacific. To the leaders of Japan, most of the people who were not Japanese were seen as inferior and should be stopped trying to ruin Japan's major goals, and in 1937 this came to a boiling point. Japan invaded China, or at least Manchuria, and entered into the start of the Second World War. They did this for more territory, more resources, more area for Japanese settlement, and of course, for pride of beating the most populous Asian nation. For the first 2 years of the war, Japan was winning badly, to the point where it was less of a war and more of a massacre, but by 1939 it had become more of a stalemate. The war was extremely bloody and brutal even by World War II standards, with the Japanese motto, "Kill all, burn all, and loot all," taken to heart of many soldiers. By 1940, Japan had joined the full war with Germany and Italy and started looking at not just China. All production in the country went towards the military, and economic conditions worsened when pretty much all domestic consumption and investment was cut off. Only very small sections like the steel producers were better off during this war. But for this massive military to function, they still needed materials. They needed coal from China, oil from Burma and Indonesia, tin from Malaya and Indonesia, and oil from the Philippines. Hold on, the Philippines is American, and we still want the whole Pacific, said Japan. So Japan just surprised the US by blowing up their harbor. They fought the biggest naval war ever with the US, and when their supplies reached their peak in 1942, they began to decline. During the later years of the war, rationing, electrical outages, and bombings destroyed the lives of the ordinary Japanese. But despite all of the shortages of supplies, killing their people, and absolute destruction of their country, they would still never surrender. And again. Well, I guess that's one way to end the Japanese Empire. Time to rebuild. The great thing about hitting rock bottom is there's only one way to go, baby. And trust me, the Japanese definitely hit rock bottom during the final days of World War II. The second half of the Showa period is what some people call the Japanese miracle, maybe because it was a miracle what Japan turned into. The second rise of Japan had officially started in 1945 when the Allied powers dissolved the Empire of Japan. Germany was split up between all friends of the Allies, but Japan was just given to the US of A. Now, during this time, the US was less of bald eagles, guns, and freedom, and more social services, building infrastructure, and loving unions after the New Deal got them out of the Great Depression. During their occupation of Japan, they set democracy back up, giving women the right to vote this time too, broke up major conglomerate structures called zaibatsus, and expanded social services and infrastructure spending, especially on their railway. Their main strategy was to invest into rebuilding the people of Japan using their huge budget surplus from a now defunct military and using the US's military as their own. They rebuilt their industry like electricity and coal production and invested heavily into education, which made Japan a hub for technological innovation. Since they were demilitarized, Japan provided the Western nations with economic power rather than military, like during the Korean War. The US left Japan on their own in 1952 and left with them the democratic and innovative spirit. They also love baseball in Japan now from that 7-year occupation, so some culture did stick around too. The Japanese miracle marked a period where Japanese growth was 3 times as fast as American or British growth, and they did it mostly without foreign money. They achieved it through economic and trade liberalization and a massive consumer market. I mean, the post-war Japanese just love to consume, another trait from their American father. By 1955, Japan had already gone past their pre-war output levels. To develop their heavy industries in the 60s like manufacturing and mining, they started exporting like crazy, and by 1968 they were the second biggest economy on earth, at least the second biggest non-commie economy. The growth changed in the 1970s when during the two oil shocks, Japan was looking shaky. Japan has a huge consumer base who depends on oil, but they're a small island without a domestic oil supply, so production shrank in their first recession since the war, and Japan reduced their dependence on oil throughout the 70s and 80s, opting for natural gas and nuclear options instead. But after they continued their path of exporting technology to the world, now cars, electronics, computers, semiconductors, video games, shows, you name it, Japan was a full-fledged cultural exporter now, mainly through technology, becoming the largest vehicle producer on Earth in 1980. The 1980s were a time when Japan was booming and consumerism hit a high never seen before. Imports were growing faster than exports for the first time, and Japan signed the Plaza Accord to make the yen appreciate against the US dollar. The consumption-based growth had eventually become a bubble, with the Japanese stock market doubling in just a year and becoming the largest on Earth ahead of the New York Stock Exchange. Yen was a bubble, financial assets were a bubble, housing was a bubble, production was a bubble, many companies were overvalued, and eventually it all had to pop. The Showa period came to an end when Emperor Hirohito died in 1989, making Japan just unstable enough for the entire bubble economy to pop. It was now the Heisei period, starting off with a complete economic crash. Stock prices, housing, bonds, and production all collapsed when the bubble popped. Deflation due to prices coming down dug Japan into an even deeper hole as companies and people chose not to spend their more valuable currency now. The 1990s have thus been called the lost decade in Japanese history, but it should really be the lost decade since they didn't recover until 2005. In fact, ever since the 90s, the 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s are not looking too good either. Don't get me wrong, the Japanese have been living a high-income life compared to almost everywhere else on Earth, but compared to many people's vision of Japan passing the USA, it definitely didn't live up to their dream. In addition, by 2010, they've been stuck in a demographic hole that they cannot get out of. They passed their peak population in 2010, shrinking every year since then. It makes sense. Japan has become incredibly urban due to the opportunities for people in the city rather than in the countryside, especially living in a booming technological economy. But being in the city means 1. You most likely live in an apartment, 2. You're focusing on work, and 3. You became poorer when the 1989 bubble bursted. All of these factors contribute to the Japanese people not having kids, with Japan's birth rate plummeting since the 1970s, now around 1.3 kids for every woman. Deaths surpassed birth in 2007, cementing Japan as a dying, shrinking economy. The younger Japanese will be forced to support a much larger, older population, likely causing many industries which aren't essential to contract. Part of this will mean that Japan focuses effort inwards during this demographic collapse, forgetting the export-based industrialization and technological innovation which made them rich in the first place. By 2050, Japan will be at 105 million people, and by 2100, it will be at 75 million, from around 125 million today. It's the big question of the future of the Japanese people. Are they ready for the collapse? So far, the country is looking bleak, with more external events thrown at them. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis. In 2008, the global financial crisis. In 2011, the Fukushima disaster. And in 2020, COVID-19 and the worst recession since World War II. So, can Japan get out of this rut? Can Japan rise again? This is the more speculative part of the video, but I say yes, Japan can get out of this mess. Now, there's absolutely no way to stop this demographic collapse from happening. Japan can't force everyone to start having kids, especially when there's no space for them to live in huge urban environments. Plus, even if they could, it would take about 30 years before these kids became useful and gave more than they took, so there's no way out of this crash. But Japan is not alone in this crash. Many other countries are also going through this. Korea, China, Russia, Germany, Italy, Taiwan, and most of the world will as soon as they are urbanized enough. The major advantage Japan has going into this crash is that they will be the first one to do it. It makes sense that the first one to crash will be the first one to recover, and when they recover, the leftover land and production and capital can now go to the smaller Japanese population, making everyone a little richer. Of course, this will not happen all at once, and you will not see it happening. It will happen over decades, happening in small increments every year. As Japan recovers, many parts of the world will be going through what they had just gone through, leaving them a much more powerful nation. It also doesn't hurt that Japan got rich, like really rich, before the collapse. Japan is the world's third largest economy with a very decent per capita income. Along with enough capital to invest in automation now, Japan could become the first robot-based economy, with most low-level jobs replaced by machines and the leftover humans to do more lucrative jobs. Compare this to a place like Eastern Europe, who is also going through a demographic collapse, but without this investment into automation. They will have a harder time recovering. What about all our production centers we can't automate away? I mean, it's not cheap at all to automate, and cheap labor exists outside of Japan. Well, Japan has recently started a mission to build their factories in the region they're planning on selling to. But in order to do this, Japan needs safe water lanes. It gives Japan a major incentive to keep the global supply chain alive and thriving. They'll need oil from the Middle East and tin from Indonesia to supply their car factories in Africa. And the Japanese in the future will likely make sure that they can ship these materials. It's a major reason why Japan has started remilitarizing, even creating their first overseas base in Djibouti in 2010. If this sounds familiar, it's because this is a core Japanese problem ever since they industrialized. They need resources from outside of their island, they need sea lanes open, and soon they'll also need labor from outside of Japan. It doesn't hurt that because they're an island, the naval power comes naturally to them. As China runs out of steam for its own reasons, Japan might step in to take the place as the Asian power of the region. We've seen it before, and we could see it again. So who knows, Japan is a region which has historically risen to power for its willingness to modernize and adapt to change, but fallen because of their overambition trying to secure the supply chains and waterways necessary to keep that growth going. They rose again because of that same adaptation to change, this time exporting technological innovation, and fell again because of the overvalued economy of Japan, and the change required them to give up having kids. So whenever Japan can recover from their fall, it's only a matter of time before they try to secure their production lines again and place themselves as one of the great powers of the world.